May 1st, 1945. Berlin. The Third Reich is collapsing in flames and rubble. Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, the man who knew every secret, controlled every file, orchestrated the roundup of millions, walks out of Hitler's bunker and vanishes into history. No body, no grave, no confession, no closure. He simply disappears. But here's the question that haunts historians to this day. What happened to the family he left behind? What becomes of a wife and children when their husband and father is history's most wanted ghost? This is the story of the Müller family, a story more mysterious and heartbreaking than any thriller, because, unlike their notorious patriarch, they couldn't just disappear. The bureaucrat of death. To understand what happened to the Müller family, we first need to understand Heinrich Müller, because the mystery of his disappearance would shape every moment of his family's future. Heinrich Müller was born on April 28, 1900, in Munich, Bavaria. Not to wealth, not to privilege, to a lower middle-class Catholic family. His father was a rural police official. Young Heinrich was baptized Catholic, attended Catholic schools, and by all accounts, had an unremarkable childhood in the fading years of Imperial Germany. He fought in World War I as a pilot and emerged decorated for bravery. After the war, like many veterans, he joined the Bavarian police force in 1919. And here's where the story takes its crucial turn. Müller was good at police work, frighteningly good. He specialized in monitoring and suppressing communist activities, building files on thousands of left-wing activists throughout the 1920s. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Müller faced a problem. He wasn't a Nazi. In fact, his superiors described him as politically unreliable because he'd been too effective at investigating Nazi party members alongside communists. But Heinrich Müller had something the Nazis valued more than ideology: competence. Cold, bureaucratic, ruthless competence. By 1939, Müller had risen to become chief of the Gestapo's political police division. In 1940, he was appointed chief of Amt 4, Office 4 of the Reich Security Main Office, meaning he was the operational head of the entire Gestapo. And in 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, Müller sat at the table where the final solution was formalized. This wasn't a man who gave passionate speeches about racial purity. This was a man who made trains run on time, trains carrying millions to death camps. He compiled lists, he processed paperwork. He made the machinery of genocide function with terrifying efficiency. Adolf Eichmann, the logistical architect of the Holocaust, reported directly to Müller every deportation order, every transport list, every execution directive. It all crossed Müller's desk. And yet, despite being one of the most powerful and feared men in Nazi Germany, Heinrich Müller lived a remarkably ordinary domestic life. The family man. In 1924, Heinrich Müller married Sophie, a woman from a respectable Catholic family in Munich. Sophie was by all accounts a traditional Bavarian Catholic wife, devout, domestic, devoted to her family. Together, they had 2 children, a son, Reinhard, born in the mid-1920s, and a daughter, Elisabeth, born a few years later. The Müller family lived a quiet, middle-class life in Munich, and later in Berlin. They attended church. They maintained a modest household, especially compared to other Nazi officials who reveled in luxury and corruption. Here's what makes this story so unsettling. Heinrich Müller apparently kept his work and home life completely separate. There's no evidence Sophie knew the full extent of her husband's activities. Neighbors described the Müllers as a normal, quiet family. Heinrich was rarely home. He worked constantly, but when he was there, he was apparently a devoted father and husband. Think about that. The man who orchestrated the persecution of millions went home and read bedtime stories to his children. This wasn't Joseph Goebbels, whose children absorbed Nazi ideology from birth. This wasn't Heinrich Himmler, whose daughter Gudrun became a lifelong Nazi apologist. The Müller children were raised in a relatively normal household by a father who happened to be one of history's greatest criminals. And that normality would make what happened next even more devastating. The disappearance, April 30th, 1945. Adolf Hitler commits suicide in his bunker. Germany is defeated. The Allies are closing in. Heinrich Müller was last reliably seen on May 1, 1945, in the Führer bunker area. He was wearing his SS uniform, carrying his service pistol, and then nothing. He vanished. No confirmed death, no body, no grave. Unlike other Nazi officials whose fates were documented, Goebbels' charred corpse, Goering's suicide, Himmler's cyanide capsule, Müller left no physical evidence of his end. Theories exploded. Had he been killed in the Battle of Berlin, captured by the Soviets, escaped to South America? Some claimed he'd been a Soviet agent all along and defected to Moscow. Others insisted he'd fled via the rat lines to Argentina or Paraguay. The Americans listed him as one of their most wanted war criminals. The Israelis added him to their hunt list, alongside Eichmann and Mengele. International manhunts searched for him for decades, but Heinrich Müller had become a ghost. And while the world searched for the ghost, his family was left to face the consequences of his crimes and the endless uncertainty of his fate. The wife, who waited, Sophie Müller, faced an impossible situation in the chaotic spring of 1945. Her husband had disappeared. Germany was in ruins. The Nazi regime she'd lived under, if not actively supported, had collapsed. Allied forces were arresting anyone connected to senior Nazi officials, and she had 2 children to protect. Unlike Elisabeth Kaltenbrunner, who watched her husband hang at Nuremberg, Sophie never got closure. She didn't know if Heinrich was dead or alive. She couldn't mourn properly. She couldn't move forward cleanly. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Sophie was interrogated repeatedly by Allied investigators desperate to find Heinrich Müller. They questioned her about his plans, his contacts, his possible escape routes. She maintained, consistently and apparently truthfully, that she knew nothing, that her husband never discussed his work, that she had no idea where he went. The denazification authorities investigated Sophie extensively. Unlike many wives of senior Nazis who faced charges, Sophie Müller appears to have been classified as a follower, someone who benefited from Nazi rule but wasn't actively involved. Her devout Catholicism may have helped. The church vouched for her character. But here's where the story takes a haunting turn. Sophie never remarried. For the rest of her life, despite having no confirmation of her husband's death, despite the overwhelming probability that he was dead, she remained Sophie Müller. Was this loyalty, denial, a peculiar form of Catholic devotion, or simply the paralysis that comes from never having closure? Sophie Müller died in Munich in 1968 at the age of 67, still waiting for answers that never came. She lived for 23 years after her husband vanished, never knowing his fate, never able to fully grieve, never able to fully move on. But it's what happened to her children that reveals the true cost of being born to Gestapo Müller, the son who disappeared into normalcy. Reinhard Müller, Heinrich's son, was approximately 20 years old when his father vanished. Old enough to understand exactly who his father was, old enough to have formed memories, old enough to carry the full weight of that name. And Reinhard made a choice. He would disappear too, not physically, but into the most profound obscurity possible. Unlike the children of some Nazi officials who gave interviews or wrote memoirs, Reinhard Müller gave nothing. No statements, no interviews, no public acknowledgement of his heritage. He became a ghost haunting his father's ghost. But here's what we do know, pieced together from fragmentary records and historical research. Reinhard Müller changed his name. The exact name he adopted remains largely unreported out of respect for privacy, but he took a common German surname that would allow him to blend into post-war society. He married. Some sources suggest he had children, meaning there are grandchildren of Heinrich Müller walking around today, likely completely unaware of their ancestry, or living with that knowledge as a closely guarded secret. Reinhard pursued what appears to have been an ordinary career. Some accounts suggest he worked in civil service or business, far removed from anything political or connected to his father's past. He lived in southern Germany, possibly in Bavaria, possibly in Munich itself, choosing to hide in plain sight rather than flee to a new country. Think about the psychological weight of that decision. Every time he filled out a form, every time someone asked about his family, every time he met new people, Reinhard Müller now living under a different name, had to maintain the lie of omission. He had to pretend his father was an ordinary man who died in the war, not the chief of the Gestapo, who vanished into history. Reinhard Müller died sometime in the 1990s, having lived his entire adult life under an assumed identity, never publicly speaking about his father, never confronting the legacy in any documented way. His silence was so complete that most historical accounts of Heinrich Müller's family barely mention him at all. The daughter's dilemma. Elisabeth Müller, Heinrich's daughter, faced similar challenges to her brother, but with one crucial difference. As a woman in post-war Germany, she had the option, indeed, the expectation, to change her surname through marriage. Elisabeth was approximately 17 years old when her father disappeared, still a teenager, still forming her identity, and suddenly thrust into a nightmare where her surname was synonymous with mass murder. Historical records regarding Elisabeth's adult life are scarce, which itself tells a story. What we can piece together suggests she married in the late 1940s or early 1950s, adopting her husband's surname and effectively erasing the Müller name from her public identity. But here's the cruel irony. Even marriage couldn't fully erase her past, because Heinrich Müller didn't just disappear. He remained one of history's greatest mysteries. Every few years, a new sighting would make headlines. A body would be exhumed, claimed to be Müller's. A document would surface suggesting he'd been captured by the Soviets. Each time this happened, the media frenzy would reignite. Reporters would track down family members. Old photographs would be republished. And Elisabeth, trying to live a normal life under her married name, would be dragged back into the spotlight she tried so desperately to escape. Unlike Gudrun Hitler, who remained Gudrun Hitler and actively defended her father's legacy, Elisabeth chose erasure. Unlike Martin Bormann Jr., who became a priest and spoke openly about rejecting his father's ideology, Elisabeth chose silence. She married, likely had children, and lived what appears to have been a quiet life in Germany. She gave no interviews, made no public statements, left no memoir. Elisabeth died sometime in the early 2000s, having spent nearly 60 years living in the shadow of a father she couldn't mourn, couldn't defend, and couldn't escape. But here's what no one expected. The story of the Müller family has one more twist, one that reveals just how complicated the legacy of Nazi officials became in post-war Germany. In 1963, a body was found in a mass grave in Berlin and identified as Heinrich Müller based on dental records. The West German government officially declared him dead, case closed, except it wasn't. In 1973, that same body was exhumed and re-examined. The identification was disputed. The dental records didn't match as precisely as originally claimed. The mystery deepened. Each time this happened, the media frenzy would reignite. Reporters would track down family members. Old photographs would be republished. And Elisabeth, trying to live a normal life under her married name, would be dragged back into the spotlight she tried so desperately to escape. Unlike Gudrun Himmler, who remained Gudrun Himmler and actively defended her father's legacy, Elisabeth chose erasure. Unlike Martin Bormann Jr., who became a priest and spoke openly about rejecting his father's ideology, Elisabeth chose silence. She married, likely had children, and lived what appears to have been a quiet life in Germany. She gave no interviews, made no public statements, left no memoir. Elisabeth died sometime in the early 2000s, having spent nearly 60 years living in the shadow of a father she couldn't mourn, couldn't defend, and couldn't escape. But here's what no one expected. The story of the Müller family has one more twist, one that reveals just how complicated the legacy of Nazi officials became in post-war Germany. In 1963, a body was found in a mass grave in Berlin and identified as Heinrich Müller based on dental records. The West German government officially declared him dead, case closed. Except it wasn't. In 1973, that same body was exhumed and re-examined. The identification was disputed. The dental records didn't match as precisely as originally claimed. The mystery deepened. The cost of the name. Here's what makes the Müller family's story different from other families of Nazi criminals. the absence of certainty. When the children of executed Nazis like Kaltenbrunner or hanged war criminals like Julius Streicher faced the world, they at least knew their father's fates. They could process that reality, however painful. They had an ending to the story, even if it was a horrific one. The Müller children never got that ending. Their father became a legend, a ghost story, a conspiracy theory. Books and documentaries speculated about his fate. Amateur historians developed elaborate theories. Each generation of researchers claimed they'd found the truth about what happened to Gestapo Müller. And with each new book, each new documentary, each new revelation, the Müller family was dragged back into the spotlight. Think about what that does to a person. You've built a new life. You've changed your name. You've raised children who don't know about their grandfather. You've created a protective wall of normalcy around yourself. And then someone publishes a book claiming your father defected to the Soviet Union and lived in Moscow until 1970. Or that he escaped to South America and died in Brazil in 1968. Or that he was actually buried in Berlin all along but the grave was misidentified. Each claim requires investigation. Each investigation brings reporters to your door. Each question threatens to expose the secret you've spent decades protecting. The Müller children didn't just inherit their father's crimes, they inherited his eternal mystery. The grandchildren, who may not know, here's where this story becomes particularly haunting. There are almost certainly grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Heinrich Müller alive today. Based on the timeline, Reinhard and Elisabeth were both of childbearing age in the 1950s and 60s. We're talking about people who are now in their 60s and 70s, and their children who are in their 30s and 40s. Do they know? This is the question that haunts any discussion of Nazi descendants. How much did Reinhard and Elisabeth tell their children? Did they maintain the lies they'd constructed, taking the truth to their graves? Or did they, at some point, sit their children down and explain the terrible truth? Your grandfather was Heinrich Müller. He ran the Gestapo. He vanished in 1945. We don't know if he's dead or alive. We changed our names. We've been hiding ever since. The psychological literature on descendants of perpetrators suggests that family secrets like this rarely stay buried completely. Children sense something. They notice inconsistencies in stories. They find old photographs with questions attached. And in the age of DNA testing and online genealogy, it's becoming increasingly difficult to hide family connections. Somewhere out there, someone may have submitted their DNA to an anti-century website and discovered they're related to one of history's most wanted war criminals. How do you process that information? How do you integrate it into your identity? The grandchildren of Heinrich Müller face a unique challenge. They're removed enough from the crimes to feel no personal responsibility, but close enough that the connection still matters, still shapes how people might view them if it became public. The silence as strategy. Let's be clear about something. The Müller family's strategy of complete silence and erasure was, in many ways, successful. Compare their story to that of the Frank family. Nicholas Frank, son of Hans Frank the Butcher of Poland, wrote scathing books condemning his father, gave countless interviews, and made his rejection of his father's legacy his life's work. He's famous, or infamous, for his outspoken denunciation of Nazi Germany and his father's role in it. Or consider the Goering family. Hermann Goering's daughter, Edda, remained loyal to her father's memory, married and had a daughter herself, and lived a relatively public life, despite, or perhaps because of, her infamous surname. The Müller family chose neither path, trying to piece together what happened to their father. Their erasure made it harder to close one of World War II's most persistent mysteries, the mystery that won't die. Even now, in 2026, the mystery of Heinrich Müller's fate continues to fascinate historians and amateur researchers. In 2013, German researchers claimed to have definitively identified Müller's grave in Berlin, based on advanced forensic techniques. But questions remained. Other historians disputed the findings. The truth is, we may never know with certainty what happened to Heinrich Müller after May 1st, 1945. The most likely scenario, supported by the best available evidence, is that he died in Berlin during the final days of the war and was buried in a mass grave, with his body later misidentified or lost in the chaos of post-war record-keeping. But, most likely, isn't certain. And that gap between probability and certainty is where the ghost of Gestapo Müller continues to live. For the Müller family, this means their ordeal may not raise the active body. As long as the mystery persists, as long as researchers keep investigating, as long as new theories emerge, the family will remain connected to a man they've spent 80 years trying to forget. The moral complexity of inherited names. Here's where we need to grapple with a profound moral question. What obligation do the descendants of war criminals have to history? The Müller children chose to change their names and disappear. Many people would say that was their right, that they deserved privacy, that they'd suffered enough by being born to the father they were born to. But consider this: Heinrich Müller's victims didn't get to choose anonymity. The families of those murdered in the Holocaust don't get to forget. Survivors and their descendants carry trauma that spans generations. Is it fair that the Müller family got to simply walk away, to create new identities, to live normal lives, while the families of their father's victims continue to grapple with intergenerational trauma? This isn't an easy question, and there's no simple answer. Guilt is individual, not hereditary. We don't punish children for their parents' crimes in modern justice systems. That's a fundamental principle of law and morality. And yet, the Müller children benefited from their father's position during the Nazi years. They lived in comfort while millions died. They enjoyed the privileges of being the family of a senior Nazi official. After the war, they were able to reintegrate into society, build careers, raise families, opportunities that were stolen from millions of Jewish children, Roma children, children of resistance fighters. Is there a moral obligation to acknowledge that, to contribute to historical understanding, to use their unique position to help ensure such atrocities never happen again? Reasonable people can disagree. The difference between the Müller children and other descendants. To understand the Müller family's choices, it helps to compare them to other families of Nazi officials. Rolf Mengele, son of Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, of Auschwitz, ultimately broke with his father's legacy. He gave interviews, provided information to investigators, and publicly stated that his father deserved to be brought to justice. That Ina Göring, great niece of Hermann Göring, voluntarily underwent sterilization to ensure she would never have children who might carry the Göring name forward. She wanted the bloodline to end. Meanwhile, Gudrun Himmler spent her entire adult life defending her father, working with organizations that helped Nazi war criminals escape justice. The Müller children chose none of these paths. They didn't break traumatically with their father's legacy, because that would require public acknowledgement of who they were. They didn't defend him, because that would draw attention. They didn't make grand gestures of atonement, because that would expose them. They chose the middle path of invisibility, and in doing so, they avoided both the condemnation that might have come from defending their father and the burden of becoming public spokespeople for reconciliation. Whether this was wisdom or cowardice depends on your perspective. What happened next would shock everyone. But here's perhaps the most surprising aspect of this story. Despite decades of searching, despite countless investigations, despite the resources of multiple intelligence agencies, no credible evidence has ever emerged that any member of the Müller family helped Heinrich Müller escape. All knew what happened to him. Sophie's interrogations revealed nothing. Reinhard and Elisabeth were questioned and re-questioned. Their mail was monitored. Their associates were investigated. Informants were placed in their social circles. Nothing. If Heinrich Müller escaped Germany, he did so without his family's help or knowledge. If he survived the war, he never contacted them. If he's buried somewhere unknown, he took that secret with him. This has profound implications for how we view the Müller family. They weren't accomplices to their father's escape. They weren't protecting a living war criminal. They were genuinely victims of his disappearance, left to deal with the consequences of his crimes, without even the grim comfort of knowing his fate. In some ways, this makes their situation more tragic than that of other Nazi families. They couldn't even properly mourn. The legacy that lives on, today, in 2026, The name Heinrich Müller appears in history books, documentaries, and Holocaust education materials as one of the key architects of Nazi terror. His Gestapo files have been studied by researchers. His role in the final solution has been meticulously documented. But what about Sophie Müller, Reinhard, Elisabeth? Their grandchildren. They exist in historical footnotes, if at all. Brief mentions, incomplete records, privacy protections that keep their later lives hidden from public view. And perhaps that's what they wanted all along, to be footnotes, to be forgotten, to fade into the anonymity they fought so hard to achieve. But history has a way of not letting go. The questions persist. Where exactly did Reinhard and Elisabeth live? What careers did they pursue? Did they ever speak privately about their father? What did they tell their children? These questions matter because they're about more than just a Müller family. They're about how we process the legacy of evil, how we treat the families of perpetrators, how we balance the demands of justice and remembrance with human compassion for innocent people caught in history's cruel machinery. The Ghost and the Shadow. Heinrich Müller disappeared on May 1st, 1945, but his shadow never left. It stretched across his wife's remaining 23 years of life, darkening every moment with uncertainty and shame. It followed his children as they changed their names and tried to build new identities. It reaches forward in time, touching grandchildren and great-grandchildren who may or may not know the secret of their lineage. But here's the final, terrible irony. Heinrich Müller, the man who built his career on files, on documentation, on meticulous record-keeping, left no record of his own end. The bureaucrat of death became the ghost of history. And his family became ghosts too, by choice and necessity, vanishing into ordinary lives, leaving behind only questions and fragments and silences. This is the thing about the families of history's monsters. We want them to answer for crimes they didn't commit. We want them to apologize for being born to the wrong father. We want them to serve as living reminders of evil's consequences. But they're just people. People who made choices, some courageous, some cowardly, most simply pragmatic, in impossible circumstances. Sophie Müller chose loyalty and waiting. Reinhard Müller chose anonymity and silence. Elisabeth Müller chose marriage and erasure. Were these the right choices? There's no objective answer to that question. What we can say is this: 81 years after Heinrich Müller vanished, his family remains one of World War II's most invisible legacies. They succeeded in their goal of disappearing. They became what they wanted to be: unremarkable, unknown, unnoticed. But the questions they left behind are anything but unremarkable. How long should the families of perpetrators bear the weight of crimes they didn't commit? Is choosing silence a form of complicity or a legitimate path to survival? Do we have the right to demand public accounting from private citizens whose only crime was being born to the wrong father? And here's the question that haunts this story most of all. Somewhere out there, right now, there's probably a person, maybe in Munich, maybe in Berlin, maybe somewhere else entirely, who carries Heinrich Müller's DNA. They wake up, go to work, live their lives. Do they know who their grandfather was? And if they do know, what does that knowledge do to them in the quiet moments when they're alone with their thoughts? We may never have answers. The Müller family made sure of that. They became ghosts, haunting their father's ghost, invisible echoes of an invisible man. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the only choice they had.